Hi, everyone, and welcome to The X, a podcast about how experience shapes everything from products to services to entire businesses. I'm your host, Brian McLean, and I'm here with Demetrius Madrigal. This is a special election episode. Demetrius and I are both in the middle of waiting for these voting results to come in from all the battleground states. We thought it'd be kind of fun to jump in and apply some context to everything that's going on. Demetrius had reached out to me last night and said, hey, I got an idea for a really great episode that I think would be helpful and useful for most of our listeners. So that's what we're doing. So, hey, D, how are you doing, man?
I'm doing all right. I've been watching kind of the outcomes like a hawk. And one of the reasons I thought of this was obviously we're looking at kind of like how technology changes and what we can predict for the future. But I was also seeing a lot of people talking about the polls and how inaccurate they were. So I actually took a look at the polls and compared them to what the actual outcome was in order to see, like, are they way off or kind of getting an unfair rap? So we're going to talk about that a little bit.
I saw that you created that spreadsheet that you sent over to me. So you were actually calculating everything yourself last night.
Well, I'm just kind of, I'm aggregating from different sources. So, and we could jump right into it. So I'm seeing a lot of people, some of my friends who are saying, like, the polling was terrible. It was wrong. What's wrong with this? How come this doesn't work? And I took a look at it and said, there's not a lot of states that went the opposite of what the polls were predicting. Like Florida is an example of one that just went the wrong direction. But I looked at the rest and I was like, as far as the actual state prediction, they're not that far off. So what I did is I went and took a couple of polling averages that are pretty well known. One of them from Real Clear Politics, or RCP, and the other one from 538. And I just dropped them in that table. And then I started looking at what the actual outcome was based on reporting from like New York Times, for example. And then I just did a comparison. I took a look at how far off were they. Looking at the battleground states, they weren't that far off, like realistically. Like you have Georgia, for example, right now, the counting isn't done and they expect some of these numbers to shift, for example, but they were less than a point off for RCP and just over a point for 538.
Okay.
Things like Michigan is right about RCP was right around a point. Arizona, RCP and 538 are basically right at about a point or less than a point. Nevada is right at a point for RCP. Averaging them all, RCP was, even with some of the high profile kind of misses, like Florida or Wisconsin was like 6 points off. Iowa was 6 points off. They're still at an average of within 3.25 points. So that's reasonably accurate for this kind of data collection. It's a very challenging form of data collection and analysis.
Yeah, I heard Nate Silver from 538. He was on a podcast the other day that I was listening to, and he was saying that they adjusted their models a little bit in order to kind of tighten things up a little bit because the 2016 election, they were wrong in a lot of different areas. They didn't understand exactly kind of what was happening. Do you have any insight into how things are different from 2016 to now?
So to be clear, the 538 average, I took their raw polling average. I didn't take the 538 adjustment just because I don't really understand what their adjustments are. But
Okay.
I do have a sense of what is happening on with the polling. So one of the things I will say is that if somebody's going to say, oh, they were way off, one of the things they're going to point at is the national polls. So the reality is that when they're doing these kinds of polls, they are devoting almost all of their resources to the battleground states because that is what the campaigns need in order to craft their strategies. So they're doing a lot of polls in battleground states, much fewer polls outside of those battleground states. So they might not spend a lot of time polling in even New York or California or Wyoming, for example, when it comes to the presidential election. They might look at some local polls, but local elections and things. But especially if you don't have a major senatorial race going on, then it's going to get a lot less attention. And because it has less attention, less polling data coming out of it, it's going to be a bit less reliable. The other thing to keep in mind is that you really kind of have to look at the averages because the amount of data that's coming in is such a challenge to interpret and make sense of that one one data set, one single poll from Monmouth or Emerson or something like that, they might have something idiosyncratic going on. So people like us who are behavioral scientists who are looking at like what is going on with all this, we really want to look at how do you get into like a meta-analysis of combining all of this data so that you can make more accurate kind of understandings, insights of what's going on with the population. And the last big thing to take into account is that these things are shifting, right? You have news stories that are coming out, you have debates. So something that polling data that you're getting in, middle of September could very much change by the time you get to, the beginning of November. And not only that, but sometimes people even change their mind from like if they did a poll on Friday evening, by the time they get to Tuesday morning, they might have changed their mind. It's very possible. And you hear about these stories where somebody says to a pollster, I'm going to vote for so-and-so, but once I got down here and I was looking at it, I just couldn't do it and I changed my mind. So that happens. Those are all factors to keep in mind.
Yeah. Why do you think that is, though? Because one of the questions that people always ask me, because of our background in behavioral science, is don't people already know who they're voting for a week or two before the election? I mean, haven't you already made up your mind after a year and a half of, everything that's been going on and all the debates and all those things? Like, what do you think is occurring like in that moment where someone goes, okay, I voted for Trump before, but this time I've chosen to vote for Biden, and they make that shift at that moment at the actual polling location?
Well, it's difficult. I mean, I would largely be speculating, but sometimes people take a look at what's going on. People take a look at kind of the environment, for example, like some of these places we saw some voter intimidation going on, some people who are loudly protesting. I don't imagine there's a great deal of people who are saying they're voting for Trump and then switching over to Biden or vice versa. But what could be happening is people who are saying they're going to vote for somebody and they just decide not to vote for president at all, or they vote for some third party candidate or put in a write-in. When Hillary Clinton was running in the previous election, 2016, there were large numbers of votes in those Midwestern blue wall states where they voted on every other topic but left president blank. That is one of the factors that are very difficult to take into account.
Yeah. And what would you say are the biggest challenges with polling? Because I know it's a very divisive topic, because some people just follow it down to like every number and they're like, oh, I know exactly what's going to happen on election day. And some people are like, I don't believe in polls.
Well, so these last two elections with Trump have been particularly difficult to predict with polls. And that is because they are largely looking at who are the likely voters, right? So you always see that when you're looking at a poll, it'll say registered voters, it'll say likely voters. So likely voters a lot of times is what they are going to base a lot of their strategy around. So that's like the most heavily weighted poll, right? That's what people are looking at. But it is very difficult to determine at this point in time, because Trump is such a disruptor, who really are the likely voters. So a lot of times I don't really necessarily know their criteria, because we don't really work in polling, we work in tech. But if I would expect that traditionally what they would base likely voting on is previous history of voting and demographics of people who tend to vote. So they're going to say, if somebody says, yes, I plan to vote this year, but they've never voted before and they're in a demographic that has low voter turnout, like a very young person, for example, then they might say, they say they're voting, but we're not entirely sure. Likewise, if somebody has never not voted before or has voted every year for the past 30 years, or 30 elections over the past 30 years, and they're in a demographic cohort that has very high turnout, they'll say, okay, this is a safe voter. But now, with Trump coming in and energizing that base, there is likely a lot of voters out there that they look at the data from previous elections and say, we don't really expect this to be a likely voter, but they're turning out anyway. So Trump has done a great job, however you feel about his politics. He has done a great job at energizing his base and getting that voter turnout, which is really confusing the whole issue as far as interpreting the data within the polls.
Yeah, I heard that this was one of the elections where they had the one of the biggest voter turnouts in history on both sides.
On both sides.
So
Yeah.
like total number of voters has gone up drastically, which is great. I feel like everyone should be voting, and that's actually one of the topics I want to talk about in a minute. I know you maybe had a couple other things that you wanted to talk about on this, but just to kind of point out is that in the future, and hey, this could be 5 years from now or 20 years from now, I'm not really sure. I think where we're heading is vote by phone or vote on the computer, right?
Yeah.
Like the idea that we can vote online. I think it's going to take a lot to get there. Personally, this
Hmm.
is just an opinion. I don't have any factual actual data on this, from any of these companies that are trying to do this. All I know is that it takes both parties to agree on it, a lot of security, all that kind of good stuff. But kind of to wrap up this whole section here on voting, you and I talk about this all the time, especially in tech when we're working with different companies, is that self-report has to be handled very, very, very properly, because it is fundamentally unreliable, because we are not standing over someone's shoulder and observing their behavior. We're
Yeah.
asking them what they think or what they think they might do.
Yeah.
So there has to be like this, error rate built into it, and you have to know who you're talking to. I mean, I would imagine that that's the same thing that they're dealing with when doing these state and national polls as well, right?
Yeah. So it's very important to keep in mind, for the most part, what they're doing is surveys. So surveys are some of the most challenging pieces of data to actually interpret and make sense of. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is you're relying on their statement about any given thing. So for us, it might be their description of their behavior, like how many times that they looked at their phone. But people are just they don't track that. It's not something they pay attention to. They're kind of estimating. So what they're saying could be wildly off, not because they're lying, but just because of their own perception of their own behavior. And people have been shown to be off or to be wrong or to misremember. Or if they're saying they want something, then that's one of the things we take a look at is if someone we're working with is looking at it rolling out a new product. One of the things we want to do is ensure that people are going to find that product interesting, and they're going to want to either buy it or use it or whatever it might be. And if you're just going off of a simple up or down, yes or no answer to a question, then they could very easily be wrong. This is the same thing with the polling. Is if you're just asking somebody, especially within a survey, who you're going to vote for, they could be wrong. It's a prediction about future behavior, so they could be incorrect about what their future behavior is going to be. They could be lying. It's entirely possible. I don't think people tend to lie on these kinds of things, but it's definitely something to keep in mind. And it's just something that that's why when we mentioned kind of taking the aggregate of multiple polls, taking an average, then that should help wash out some of that noise. And one of the things that we like to do is instead of doing like a survey, at least not a survey by itself, we like to do interviews, because then we're actually talking to somebody. We can get to know them a little bit. They can get to trust us a little bit, and we can look for contradictions within some of the data that they're giving us. And we can also, when we're formulating our questions for interviews, and to some extent we try to do this with surveys too, is we're not usually asking a question to get a straight up or down answer. We're asking questions to get a conversation going and get that person to elicit behavior. So, for example, if we're asking somebody, who are you going to vote for, Trump or Biden? And they say, oh, I'm definitely going to vote for Biden. I'm like, okay, great. What do you like about Biden? Is there policies that stand out for you? And if they can name some policies, rattle it off of their head, then we could say, okay, this person is exhibiting behavior that is indicating that they have really thought about this, and they're engaging in some of the kind of peripheral behavior around voting for this person. And it's the same thing for
Absolutely.
us when we're evaluating a product concept. If we ask them, hey, do you think you would want this? And they say yes. I'm like, okay, great. How do you expect to use it? And if they can give us like a vivid description of how this is going to fit into their life or how it's going to change their process, we know, okay, their verbal and mental behavior is kind of already adapting to having this product in their life. But if somebody comes out and says, hey, do you think you would use this? And they say, I think so. And then we ask them the follow up question, how would you use it? And we're like, I'm not really sure. I guess I would just use it for this or that. And they just kind of rattle off kind of a rote answer. Then that's a much less reliable answer to that question.
Absolutely. And it's complicated. And I'm glad there's companies like 538 and stuff like that that are really digging in and day out and really trying to figure out what's going on and conducting their own research as well as looking at other people's research and kind of telling those stories for the rest of us, because it's a lot of work to try to figure out and predict who's going to win these elections based on this data. One of the things I wanted to jump over and talk about is the future of voting. So in Silicon Valley, where we're at, there's this constant conversation about when are we going to get to the point where people can vote online. So there are some apps that have been created. One that has gotten a lot of news, which is it's called Votes, VOATZ, and it uses blockchain technology to quote unquote securely allow you to vote. And it's been tested. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But for those of you who don't really follow blockchain but may have heard of the term, it's the backend technology behind cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. Okay, and basically what blockchain is, and I'm just going to kind of give you a little summary here. It's a system of recording information in a way that makes it basically difficult or impossible to hack or adjust, because it's a digital ledger of transactions that is duplicated and distributed across the entire network of computer systems. So it's very transparent. So it's not like one file being stored somewhere and then someone hacks it and suddenly they change votes or something like that. It's a ledger that is distributing this everywhere and has to be verified and things like that. So it's very difficult to combat it. So one of the conversations that's been happening and clearly has turned itself into an app is, could we use the blockchain technology, the backend technology of things like Bitcoin, and apply it to voting? And it was actually done. They actually tested this stuff. So let me give you a little rundown here. So Votes was most recently used in the 2020 Utah State GOP convention and enabled voting for almost 4,000 delegates in 40 races. Okay. And they're kind of testing it out basically in these different areas. It was also used in the Arizona GOP convention, the South Dakota GOP convention, and the Michigan Democratic Party convention. It was also used as a temporary mobile voting solution to record votes for the U.S. military in 2018. So it's being tested and deployed here and there, but we're not really there yet. And here's the reason why. Because researchers, basically security researchers and computer scientists, they will take technology like this and then try to break it. And they try to figure out its vulnerabilities. It's so important for our democracy to ensure that this stuff is really dialed in and there's not going to be any issues in the future if we decide to move over to online voting. Well, some of the best researchers in the entire world are at MIT. And they did a study on the Votes app, and they came up with some real issues when it came to security. And here's what they found. And I wanted to break this down for everyone because there's a lot of data. I had to read all these data sheets, and that way you don't have to. So one of the quotes from the researcher at MIT said, "It does not appear that the app's protocol attempts to verify genuine votes with backend blockchain yet." So this is important because we want to ensure that every vote that's being recorded is also verified either somewhere else or uses a technology to ensure that Brian's vote is the vote that actually got recorded. And then take that recorded vote and maybe even verify it again, right? Super important. So that's something that they're, I'm sure, working on, and they kind of pointed that out as a potential vulnerability. The app also poses some privacy issues for users. So the app uses an external vendor for voter ID verification, and a third party could potentially access a voter's like photo, driver's license data, and all that if the vendor's platform isn't also secure. So whenever you're adding a second layer, like a vendor attached to your app, or a third party that has to verify something, or is used for like certain financial transactions, stuff like that, now you have two entities that have to have very robust security on them. And it's not just about the one that you've created, but it's also about everyone else who's attaching to you. So more work probably needs to be done to ensure that the third parties that are attaching to apps like this have a very strict protocol on security and are very transparent so that both security researchers as well as company founders as well as anyone else who needs to go in and verify that everything is accurate and correct can do that as well. And finally, there's a little bit of a lack of transparency. So if a vote is made on a paper ballot, we can go and just take a look at that ballot and say, oh, look, this area was bubbled in, like in California, or maybe it's like a Chad thing, and it was poked through in another state. You can quickly verify that stuff, right? But with the app and the infrastructure, they're basically built closed source. So it's not like myself and Demetrius can go and look at their code and kind of see how things came in and verify that everything is accurate and double check ballots and stuff like that. It's all done internally. So there has to be a process where people can, third parties such as the government or whatever it is, can go in and look and make sure that everything is accurate. Not that anyone was doing anything wrong, but just a verification. As we're seeing right now with the presidential election, everyone wants things to be counted 2 and 3 times. They want to make sure that they understand the process. There was nothing, inaccurate with the process of counting votes, things like that. So there has to be a structure set up in order to do that. So those are kind of like the 3 areas that they pointed out. I personally believe this is and will be the future of voting, but I don't see this happening right away. And I'm not saying that because I have any information from any of these companies about it. It's only because we're just not fully there yet. Like if you talk to people who are not living in a more tech heavy area, they tend to say, oh, I don't know about that. Like the public looks at it and goes, I'm not really sure if that's the direction we're ready to go. Like I would need this stamp of approval from the US government, and I would need both parties to agree to it. So I think we're heading in the right direction, but I don't think it's going to be like the next time we have a major presidential election that this type of stuff is going to be used. I think you're going to see it at small scale to start. What do you think about all this stuff, D?
Well, I think it has a lot of potential. And one of the reasons is that it actually has the potential to be much more secure than any other voting technology being used currently. And that includes, paper and pen. A lot of people will say that, it can't be hacked, but it actually can. It definitely can be hacked. Like it's not that hard usually to counterfeit ballots or to hide ballots, and we're seeing that with some of the reports in places like Atlanta and Florida, where some of the mail-in ballots just didn't get delivered, and DeJoy is going to have to go in front of a federal judge and argue why he thinks that's okay. But with blockchain, and one thing I'll add on to kind of the technical description of blockchain, and this might be a little bit more for people who are familiar with kind of with the technical aspect of things. But the idea is that you've got a single ledger that is being managed through distributed processing. So little bits and pieces of the ledger are being handled by a variety of different computers out in the world. And it's constantly being backed up across the different computers. So in order to hack the blockchain, you have to execute multiple simultaneous hacks of different computers around the world that might have different levels of security on them. So it's something that at this point in time is nearly impossible to hack. Who knows what the future might bring with AI and systems that could potentially do this. But right now it's extremely secure and robust. And one of the things that it does really well, and it's why it's being used for cryptocurrencies, and I think Kodak was developing it for digital rights management. It's very difficult. It's nearly impossible at this point to counterfeit on it. So votes, for example, it's very, very difficult to counterfeit ballots and to create fake ballots or to create duplicates that aren't going to be corrected by the system automatically. Where the challenge comes in is that blockchain is providing the back end, but you still have to worry about the front end, right? You still have to get that data from people's phones to the blockchain. And that's where a lot of the security vulnerabilities are showing up. Ultimately, it absolutely has the potential for that front end to be very secure. You can use multi-factor authentication. If people want to, anything that the Republican side is very worried about voter fraud. If they want to implement requiring photo ID, taking a photo of the person, checking their fingerprint, those are all things that can be implemented into a system like this, so that you can absolutely 100% validate that this person who's casting this vote is this person, right? You already have a lot of this technology with your bank or other financial institutions, and those banks are absolutely investing heavily in blockchain too for these same reasons. But for it to transmit back and forth and for all of that to be secure against hacking, that is obviously a huge challenge. Now, there are companies out there who are very good at this kind of stuff. And what I think that it was going to kind of require for this kind of technology to really work is for those companies who are very good at this kind of stuff to get involved in developing this technology. It's probably not going to be a kind of, startup from Colorado or something. It's probably going to have to be some of those big tech companies who do it, which then poses its own challenges, because if it is a company like Facebook, for example, or Oracle, you have to then trust them. So, and there's not a ton of trust for those companies right now. And they obviously have, a conflict of interest as far as who's going to get elected, especially potentially in the future when regulation and antitrust becomes much more of a concern for them. So I think those, aside from just public trust, are a lot of the issues that are involved with getting this to where it needs to be. I actually agree with you. I think it's going to happen. I think it has the potential to be more secure, has the potential to be much faster, both for counting votes, or both placing votes, counting votes, and executing recounts, or throwing out bad ballots or correcting bad ballots. All of those things can be done so much faster and so much more secure with the right implementation. But it's going to take a while. And I know also that the government in general tends to move pretty slowly with this kind of thing. So it might be 20 years out. At a certain point in time, we'll probably get there. The challenge then is, will the blockchain then have to evolve, because it could become vulnerable at that point. That is going to be pretty key moving forward.
Absolutely. And I think the future looks bright in this area. And don't get me wrong, I do think that this is where it's kind of heading. I just think it's going to take time. Like, you and I have had enough interaction with the government to know that things move a little bit slower, and for good purpose. Like something like this, you want to make sure that if you're going to transition to this, that it's done right, and that everybody agrees that this is the future and this is the way we want to do it. Because ultimately, you'd have instantaneous results. Basically, like the minute someone records their vote, immediately it gets tallied, right? There is no wait time for that. So, well, hey, I thought this was a lot of fun to kind of do a little tiny episode in the middle of our regular scheduled episodes. Thanks for the idea, Dee. I think this was fantastic. Hopefully this is useful to all of our listeners. And so we are going to end it right here, and we will see you all next week. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.